the Manhwa kicks off with a grand parade celebrating the return of the victorious new emperor, Lord Ashrad, who has finally ended a decade-long war. As he rides through the cheering crowd, his helmet comes off, revealing his face. While the masses shower him with praise, one figure stands out, a woman disguised as a man. Lost in her thoughts, she suddenly freezes, feeling the emperor's cold gaze upon her. She desperately tries to shield herself, but Ashrad moves on, leaving her with a sinking realization, of course, he didn't even recognize me. I was nothing more than a toy to him. He never cared. Determined to break free from being the emperor's puppet, she secures a room at an inn, seeking refuge and rest. She finally breathes a sigh of relief, believing it's all over. With Ashrad preoccupied with the empire's succession after the former emperor's death, she convinces herself he won't even notice her absence. But her peace is short-lived. A sudden noise makes her realize she forgot to lock the door. As she rushes to secure it, a familiar voice chills her to the bone. It's too late. Standing in the doorway, dripping wet, is Ashrad. Shocked, she demands to know how he found her, to which he responds with chilling certainty, "You thought I wouldn't notice? I knew what you were thinking the moment I saw you in the crowd. You wanted to run, but where would you go? I knew you'd end up here." He reveals that it was amusing to see her act according to his plan, though it pained him that even on the battlefield, all he could think about was her, while she never spared him a thought. In a sudden, fierce move, Ashrad tears her shirt from her body, his eyes filled with longing as he admits how much he's missed her. "Turn around," he commands, his voice dripping with possessive hunger. As his hand grips hers, she can only cry, knowing she's powerless against the beast who claims to love her. "I love you, Daphne. You can't even imagine how much I love you." Daphne once had a pure heart, but now, she finds herself trapped in a life spiraling into chaos. How did it come to this? A little girl smiles brightly as she shows her mother the flowers she'd picked, and her mother in response tells her that they're beautiful but the flowers are a bit sad. She's both confused and curious at the same time, and her mother explains that picked flowers are quick to wilt. Sadly, she asks her mother if she was now a bad person, but her mother tells her it's just the flowers that are weak. "Daphne is such a strong girl, so you will never wilt," she says, reassuring her. Her mother wears her necklace, which changes the color of her eyes from blue to green. Her mother praises her beautiful emerald green eyes, and out of curiosity she says to her mom, "Mom, you like my blue eyes, don't you? So why are you making them green?" Her mom replies, telling her that her mother was actually a very weak person and one day she'll understand. A person informs them of the presence of the king, and she responds that they'll be there soon. She holds on to Daphne's hand and reveals that her father had arrived. Daphne assures her that she knows what to do and she'll behave well and also never take off the necklace. A new scene appears and her father welcomes her with open arms, and she gets carried away at first, but she quickly remembers her mother's teachings and greets him formally. Her father asks her why she's being so formal, and her mom tells him she was so smart and at only 9 years old she'd managed to read all history books. Her father is impressed and calls her a good girl. However, Daphne's thoughts are different. She calls everyone around her a liar, since even though she liked history she still struggled to understand anything, and teachers indeed praised her but they hated her mother and everyone insults them behind their backs. Curious, Daphne thinks, what do the words concubine and concubine's child mean? Everyone calls us that behind our backs, and also why is my eye color different from dad's? Her mom goes to the king and says Daphne will definitely be more useful than that woman's son. She continues and says she doesn't want to burden him, but could he give Daphne a gift for her birthday, and with a smirk she reveals, "Please take Daphne to the palace." In a new scene, as Daphne's mom prepares her to go to the palace, she assures her that everyone there will love her. Daphne anxiously reveals to her mom that she really doesn't want to go to the palace and she was so scared, but her mom suddenly becomes aggressive, asking her what she was saying. Her mom asks her to show them how smart she is, and even though she's a little scared she manages to oblige. Her mom's expression softens and she hugs her goodbye, reminding her never to take the necklace off under any circumstance. She arrives at the palace with the butler assigned to her, who considers her nothing more than a nuisance threatening the position of the poor crown prince. With a harsh tone he tells her to continue on her own, since he doesn't have time to babysit her and she should be grateful that he brought her that far. After walking for a while, she realizes she's gotten lost as she looks at the huge palace building in the distance. She goes down tired and with no idea on how to reach the palace when she hears a voice say, "Lost kitten." Daphne looks up to find a boy about her age asking who she is. He helps her up and introduces himself as Ashrad. He tells her he'll be 11 soon and she tells him she's only 9. They finally arrive at the palace and he shows her where to find the king, and as she thanks him he tightens his grip on her shoulder. She screams in pain and then he lets go and apologizes. Later, as she sits on the dinner table, she reminisces about her encounter with Ashrad when she realizes something. He'd mentioned her name multiple times but she'd never told it to him. Her mom comes to join her on the table and asks her to tell her what she and her father had discussed, and Daphne reminds her mother that she'd repeatedly told it to her, but her mother tells her she'd like to listen to it over and over again. The moment the soup touches her mother's lips, she drops the spoon, collapsing instantly as blood spills from her mouth. As her mother lies on her deathbed, Daphne desperately pleads with her to hold on. The king reassures her that Daphne will be well cared for at the palace, and with her last breath, her mother whispers, "Thank God," before passing away, leaving Daphne to struggle with the heartbreaking reality of her loss. Daphne struggled to cope with the sudden loss of her mother, her tears falling uncontrollably even as she got dressed. The maid preparing her noticed that the necklace she wore clashed with her outfit for the day, and before Daphne could stop her, the maid removed it, exposing Daphne's true eye color. At that moment, the king entered the room, his eyes immediately locking onto her now blue eyes. Rushing over, he demanded to know what was going on, but Daphne could only apologize, tears streaming down her face. Realizing that his favorite mistress had been deceiving him all along, the king was consumed with rage and turned on the maids, slaughtering them in his fury. He then looks at Daphne with the same deadly intent, but hesitates, remembering that he had once loved her mother, and decides to grant her last wish, ordering Daphne to come with him to the palace. In the grand palace, Daphne is forced to clean all the floors by herself, despite being so small. As she works, she glances up at a painting, triggering a memory of when she had proudly shown her mother a drawing she'd made as a child. But instead of praise, her mother had taken the paper away, insisting she focus on dancing because she didn't need that person's heritage. Now, Daphne begins to understand that her mother might have been referring to her real father. She wonders if he was an artist and why her mother chose to deceive the king rather than stay with her true father. Tears well up in her eyes as she wishes she had been born into a normal family. At that moment, the crown prince approaches her, noticing her small figure struggling in the vast corridor. He asks if she's cleaning all by herself and if someone has hurt her. He asks about her name and Daphne instantly answers, surprised that he hadn't recognized her. The crown prince mentions that her name sounds familiar, though he couldn't remember from where he'd heard it. He reassures her that it's wrong for someone so young to be bullied and promises to find her a different job, and then asks her to come with him. The crown prince gently asks Daphne why she's being bullied, and though she's hesitant at first, she admits that it's because her mother told a big lie. However, she doesn't reveal the full story, afraid that if he is truly the crown prince, he might react with the same anger as the king when he discovered the truth. The crown prince, unaware of the details, expresses that it's unfair to blame Daphne for her mother's mistakes. He promises to call for her every day from now on, confident that once people know his concern for her, they'll stop bullying her, and with a comforting gesture, he feeds her a cookie and pats her head, praising her as a good girl. This tender moment is interrupted by the king, who demands to know what Daphne is doing there. After observing his son for a while, he unexpectedly bursts into laughter, calling it a masterpiece. While Daphne remains confused, "Isn't he being scolded for helping me?" So why is he smiling? Maybe if I stay with this person, I can find happiness. 6 years later, Daphne found solace in feeding the birds whenever she had a moment of peace. But this time, her heart filled with terror as she approached the birds, only to find them lifeless on the ground. A young boy, hearing her distressed cries, came to comfort her, and together, they made a grave for the bird. Daphne confided in him, explaining how everything she cherished always seemed to disappear, including everyone who was kind to her. She begins to believe that maybe she'd been cursed, but the boy reassures her otherwise, and just as he is about to explain the rumor going around concerning her, the ominous sound of a drum interrupts them. The news of the Empress's passing was announced, and only one thought consumed Daphne's mind: Ashrad. Later, Ashrad sits quietly, taking in the fresh air when Daphne approaches him. He apologizes for not summoning her earlier, explaining he had been very busy. But Daphne knelt before him, insisting the apology was unnecessary. Instead, she simply wanted to be his strength. "I'm here," she whispered, resting her head on his thigh. "I will always be by your side." With those words, the chaos in Ashrad's mind began to settle. "That's right," he murmured, "I still have you." His hand tightened in her hair, yanking it hard enough to make her groan in pain. "Daphne, don't forget those words. You will always be by my side, you will always obey me, and you are mine, for the rest of your life. Understood?" "Yes," she answered softly, and he smiled before pressing a kiss to her forehead. In a new scene, as carriages keep on approaching the palace, Daphne remarks at how the mourners just kept on coming in and can't help but worry about Ashrad. Another maid comes to her and tells her she looked really comfortable where she was. Daphne apologizes and says she'll go to her cleaning area, but the maid asks her if she knew what had happened to Noelle. A maid tries to stop her, but the other maid is annoyed over the fact that Daphne was the only one who had to live ignorant of everything happening. The other maid apologizes for the girl's behavior, and Daphne asks if something had happened to Noelle since she hadn't seen him recently. The girl assures her that Noelle was okay. She also informs her that she'd heard the king was going to take a walk in the garden and it would be best for her to go to her usual cleaning area before he arrives, and Daphne thanks her for her kindness. Later, as some maids are cleaning and discussing about the Empress's death, a maid mistakenly hits a bucket down. She immediately apologizes, but as soon as she notices it's Daphne, they ask her what she's doing in the way. The two maids conspire between themselves and end up sending Daphne to clean the room of the Prince of the Findus Kingdom, even though it was against protocol and rude to the guest. As Daphne cleans the guest's room, the prince comes in and immediately gets irritated that they'd failed to prepare for him even though he told them earlier. Daphne hurriedly apologizes to the prince, but when his butler tries to punish her, he stops him and says it seemed they'd prepared some decent hospitality and that was what they meant by sending her there. The prince loosens her shirt, and just as he reaches into her shirt she trembles, praying for someone to help even Ashrad. Her hopes are instantly replenished as Ashrad walks into the room. The prince reports to Ashrad that Daphne had failed to finish her cleaning, and since it was considered rude to a distinguished guest, if she were to compensate him personally he could overlook it. "Ashrad will surely save me," Daphne assures herself with her heart racing. Unfortunately, her newly found hopes were quick to shatter. If one commits a crime, it's only natural to accept punishment. "Please continue to your heart's content," he says before leaving, bringing Daphne to tears. The prince mocks her, asking if she thought the crown prince was really going to save her. He tells her that the crown prince would never save a mere maid, especially since he was desperately in need of help from the Findus Kingdom, and she wonders if she was now abandoned and if their time together meant nothing. The priests of Calith sensed a dark, ominous energy emanating from the room and ordered the door to be opened. Upon entering, they quickly realized the source of the evil energy was the prince himself, who had been engaging in obscene behavior during the sacred mourning period for the Empress. The prince was dismissive of them and claimed that he was merely warning Daphne and ordered her to leave. As Daphne steps out of the room, she is met with cold stares and harsh whispers, everyone around her blaming her for causing trouble yet again. In a new scene, a group of maids are in the palace garden, carefully gathering white roses. One maid questions why the king insists on adorning the entire palace with these flowers, despite his strained relationship with the empress. Another maid explains that it's out of respect for the empress's homeland, and the king needs to appear mournful, if only for show. Just then, Amanda spots the king strolling through the garden and quickly informs Daphne, urging her to make her exit. As Daphne walks, she hears a voice say the flowers suit you, and she looks up to find Ashrad. He tells her she hadn't come when he'd called for her recently, and he asks if something had happened. Prince Ashrad, what a kind smile, and yet, he abandoned me like that. Just what is he thinking? The only thing I can be sure of is that I was the only one who'd wanted to stay together, she thinks as she completely ignores the crown prince. To him I am completely meaningless. As Daphne passes by the crown prince, she catches his attention, leaving him visibly surprised. His butler reprimands her, but the crown prince intervenes, telling the butler to leave her be, remarking that she seemed discontented with something. In a new scene, the maids are ordered to prepare the palace for the jousting event, which the crown prince will also be participating in. As Daphne cleans obediently, she hears a person mention that the emperor was watching, and when she turns around she truly finds the emperor. The emperor tells her he'd also heard about her incident with the Prince of Findus. He tells her it seemed like she usually made her eyes at men just like her mother, which was filthy. Daphne wonders how he could describe a woman he'd once loved as filthy when the emperor suddenly grabs her jaw, asking if she was crying. He tells her her mother was also the kind to cry at the slightest inconvenience. He asks how old she'll be turning that year, and she says 17. The emperor tells her after that he'll be releasing her from all her duties in the royal palace, leaving her confused, but he just yells at her, ordering her to return to her room already. The emperor's advisor then asks why he will do that, and he responds saying it seems she resembles her mother more and more. Beatrice was a woman worth teasing. After being relieved from all her duties, Daphne sits in her room quietly when she hears the maids discussing how the crown prince had been injured during the joust. She rushes out of her room trying to get more information from them, but they just walk away. Worried, Daphne can only think about how the prince hadn't called for her ever since the time she'd ignored him, and he must have thought she was just being insolent towards him. As she continues to worry about the crown prince, a man grabs her and reports that the crown prince had called for her. "I'm glad you're here, Daphne," he says as she stands in front of him. "Now come closer." Daphne worries because he doesn't have his clothes on, and he tells her he was in the middle of changing his bandages, and since she was there she could change it for him. After she loosens the bandages, a very deep cut is revealed, causing her to zone out. Ashrad grabs her hand and tells her he was distraught about whether he should call her or not. He tells her it had felt like she was avoiding him, and he asks if it was just imagination. She tries to speak when he asks if she was angry that he'd abandoned her that day, so she then decided to ignore him. With furrowed brows, he reveals to her that he had no other choice but to do that since the Findus kingdom supports their demon beast subjugation in the southeast. He tells her he couldn't afford to hit him and destroy the diplomatic relationship with his kingdom. He then asks Daphne if she would rather he had cried, and begged the prince not to do that, and said she was his weakness. He asks Daphne to think about it, whether it was truly a coincidence that the priests of the Caliph had rushed in at that moment. He asks her if she's still angry at him and doesn't want to see him ever again, and she hurriedly denies that. She tells him she didn't know he actually saved her, and calls herself an idiot in her mind for not considering Ashrad's position, since someone as noble as him could never defend someone like her so openly. Ashrad comes to Daphne and says he wouldn't allow just anyone to stay by his side, and he may get annoyed or angry otherwise, but she was different. He asks if she knew what that meant, and immediately she starts crying, asking him to pardon her, as she also was thinking of him all those while, and if she'd known his wound was that deep she would have just come running instead of being so stubborn. The crown prince tells her he just wasn't properly equipped, and the king had commanded that the crown prince had to show face. He tells her she should go back, and she tells him she was yet to change his bandage, but he just tells her she knew the real reason why he'd called her there. She goes down on her knees and calls the crown prince before asking if she was his weakness. Ashrad looks for a while and says, "Who knows, I wonder." Daphne tells him she's worthless and could never be his weakness, but he gets tired of listening and orders her to leave. As soon as she leaves the room, Ashrad just starts laughing out loud, and when he stops he says it looks like she knows herself too well. He calls Daphne an interesting woman, and after a while of silence he calls her name and says, "You're right, you could never be my weakness, so what should I do with you from now on?" "Live as my dog, Daphne." As Daphne returns to her room, she can't stop thinking about how he told her she was different from the others, and that alone was enough to make her endure her life there no matter how hard it gets. Her thought is interrupted by Madame Olga, who asks if she just returned from the Crown Prince's room. She asks Daphne to come with her quietly, and Daphne wonders why the maid directly under the Crown Prince will need her. They throw her to the ground and immediately strip her. Mama Olga with a lantern inspects her body and finally stops when she finds no traces and says the Crown Prince would never lay his hand on a woman like her. She throws her a dress, and a maid tells her she was lucky that time, since if there had been traces she wouldn't have gotten off so easily. Daphne tries to ask why they go that far, since they could have just asked her normally, but she gets a slap in the face. A woman making eyes at the Crown Prince wouldn't answer honestly when asked, Madame Olga says. She also says since she was that vixen's daughter she couldn't believe her, and she walks out leaving Daphne alone on the floor. Daphne, already saddened, bursts into tears wondering what she's supposed to do when she knows that no matter how much the Crown Prince cares for her she isn't qualified to remain by his side. Daphne goes outside and one of the guards on his shift notices her and hands her a towel asking if she's all right. He asks if he could help her with anything, but she refuses and continues walking away. His friend comes to him and tells him she was the daughter of the vixen, who tricked the king into thinking the child she had with another man was his. He explains that both the Crown Prince and the king hated her, so it would be best to avoid her. A carriage stops in front of the palace and a beautiful-looking lady gets out of the carriage. She turns out to be the aunt of the Crown Prince, but Daphne, who stands afar watching them, misunderstands. Is she maybe a Crown Princess's candidate? Later she asks Sarah who Lady Callista is, and she explains that after the king lost the late Empress's biological mother, Lady Callista's mother was welcomed as the new queen, and the king was so fond of her that he adopted Lady Callista as his daughter. Daphne sighs a breath of relief and expresses how she thought the lady was a Crown Princess candidate, while Sarah, who seemed to notice her concern for that, asks if by chance she harbors feelings for the Crown Prince. Daphne immediately denies it, saying how could she, a mere maid. Sarah explains to her that even though they were aunt and nephew, they aren't blood related, and it was also around time for the Crown Prince to get a fiancé. She retorts that everyone at the Imperial Palace says they're well suited to another, and when Sarah finally notices Daphne's shaky hands she comforts Daphne, who'd ended up revealing her feelings for the prince. In a new scene, Daphne tries to spy on the Crown Prince from outside when Fabian comes to her and asks if she perhaps has business with the Crown Prince. Daphne is instantly surprised that someone will dare to approach her, so she tells him she's the Cuckoo's Chick. The boy immediately bursts out laughing, asking her if her name was Cuckoo's Chick, and admits that it's so funny. The boy then tells her he understands she meant that she was the vixen's daughter, so he shouldn't get too close. He tells her everyone is so mean even though she didn't commit any crime, and this being the first person who'd not blamed her for her mother's actions apart from the prince, she instantly feels the warmth she'd longed for. Fabian places his hand on her head and says he'd never seen such beautiful cuckoo before. Before she can say anything, a man comes to inform her that the king had sent for her. Daphne says goodbye to Fabian before leaving, and just as Fabian leaves to make another round, the Crown Prince stands behind a tree and he seems to have heard their discussion. In the palace, the king orders Daphne to come closer, and just as she climbs up the stairs, the king smells something unpleasant and asks her what kind of life she's been living to exude that kind of smell. The king then says he supposes only her appearance resembles her mother, but if she were a little older, she might have some use once she's in her 20s. She'll ripen nicely by then. It's convenient that she isn't my real daughter, the king says to himself before ordering the Grand Chamberlain to spray some perfume on Daphne. Miss Callista appears, and as Daphne observes how beautiful she looks, the king orders her to take her leave. Callista goes to the king, and when she asks who Daphne is, he tells her she isn't a woman worth her attention, but the lady bites her lip in annoyance that he'd used the word woman to describe her, which just makes her more interested in Daphne. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for part 2 and leave a comment telling how much you'd enjoyed the story. Subscribe for more recaps and insights into your favorite manhwa.